Alrighty. Welcome to the Morbidly Elenctic podcast, which looks to define and discuss anything from hot button political issues to different aspects of popular culture. My name is Stefan, and who we have here today is, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
My name is Fishman, no relation. I'm our resident 3D printer.
A resident 3D printer expert. Saw a lot of the Pokemon balls or like the little statues and stuff like that. And as well, the topic for today is actually the 3D printing and its potential influence towards future engineering, manufacturing, or other kind of societal impacts, kind of in general. And so I guess kind of the first thing to kind of discuss over and the first question to you would be kind of the general what is kind of 3D printing and how does it kind of operate? And to lead kind of from there is why is this even a topic to kind of discuss even in the first place? What's kind of the little small potentials within 3D printing that might make some type of impact?
Oh, right. So 3D printing is the common name for a manufacturing process known as additive manufacturing, where a hot end nozzle heats up a polymer and deposits it layer by layer to create a 3D model from the ground up, essentially. And the biggest thing about it is in the name additive manufacturing, where it differs from pretty much all of our traditional manufacturing techniques known as subtractive manufacturing. So thinking about a lathe or presses, essentially, where you either form or subtract from a larger object to create a specific model. 3D printing creates it specifically within the space that it is.
It kind of does almost like it's kind of like layering a cake. So you kind of have the layer each one. It kind of goes one by one by one. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of more focused on, if you could say, kind of how with our like AI advancements, we're able to actually kind of do like the computer program that already kind of has that chassis in mind, rather than pre-making that chassis to fit it and force mold it. It kind of has that free range where it already has that computer mold. Like it kind of has almost
right, exactly.
it's a utilitarian machine manufacturer in 100 different types that you could do just in one kind of machine. That's kind of a good idea of it, or
Yeah, so the one of the largest strengths, I think, is the sort of the production of waste between the two. So if you think about creating like a simple screw, if you were with the the traditional way that we would do it, you have, say, a blank like a rod,
yeah,
and then with a lathe you shave off layer and layer of metal into waste metal, essentially, to create the head, the smaller part, the threading. And then with 3D printing, the idea is more so that you kind of build it outwards. And so with the idea of waste in mind, they each have their own certain aspects where they're stronger, essentially. But 3D printing, it comes with a lot more advantages in the idea of 3D space. So you can begin to print objects inside of the main object where you couldn't really reach with a lathe or any kind of tool, essentially. And so you can end up getting a lot more complex shapes out of a 3D printer than you could with traditional manufacturing. And I think the biggest implication that we've seen in the last, say, like 10 years is just the accessibility of it, where you've got serious manufacturing techniques that don't require the certain skills that you would need to create certain things. So within your home, you can create these objects of varying complexity without, going through all of the schooling to learn how to machine or weld or anything like that.
that's true. It almost takes, it's just you can kind of put through that program, and you kind of, if you have that program already kind of installed, and then with the 3D printer it can kind of go through that and kind of set it up. An interesting thing as well that you said, just to cover a little bit more, where you were saying there was some aspects with the 3D printing in terms of waste. Do you know some of the few aspects where it's kind of not so much different from as well regular manufacturing, or but kind of that's kind of unique to kind of 3D printing. Where is there any kind of downside in terms of waste, or is it far more productive on that point?
So it kind of is it's a model to model basis. The largest waste that you see is with it's with angles essentially and overhangs.
Mm.
So with a model that requires sort of a an overhang or a large part cutout, you because it's printing layer by layer, you can't begin printing in empty space
Yeah.
above an object, and since it's melting the plastic to go through, you can lose details. So the largest waste factor with that is what's known as supports, where you have to, alongside the model that you're going to have and use, you have to print up essentially towers that are going to eventually meet that 3D spot and support where you begin essentially, and then those become waste production. And so it's a you could consider it maybe an equal trade-off from, say, subtract like machining, essentially. And then it just depends on essentially the complexity of what you're trying to achieve.
That's true. And as well, speaking with the complexity of that, do you think as well with like materials used for 3D printing? Because I know now it's primarily the main form with 3D printing is with anything that's kind of plastic based because it has a low heat temperature, so it can kind of melt easier. Do you think there's a lot of potential for in the future to kind of adapt that nozzle to actually grow and do other kind of metals, harder objects? And do you think that there's going to be some issues with those in terms of kind of the waste management or the how you said like building up the towers on the side, or do you think that that might also be in the future where 3D printing can find a way to kind of subtract that part or not even have to have that part as an issue?
Well, there's certainly a range of materials that you can work with at the basic consumer level, but one of the problems that they tried and kind of tackled early on as we were developing this was the idea of waste and sort of the life of these objects, because you can print any amount of thing. You know, it's kind of difficult, so failure of prints is relatively common until you're a little bit more skilled. And so they wanted, we didn't want to just put out machines that were going to throw out plastic constantly.
Yeah.
And so the biggest breakthrough is known as PLA, which is a corn-based polymer and actually biodegradable, and has similar, say, strength as traditional plastics that we generally use. So when it comes to like small odds and ends or replacement parts or little knickknacks, maybe in the end they have a much shorter life in the sort of wardly sense than a regular plastic is going to have with the same strength of it. And so, like, talking about the strength of it, another say a weak point of it is that since you're depositing layer by layer, you don't get the same strength across the whole piece.
That would be like a lot of times I would say even like doing a lot in terms of not cubes but globes or like kind of globular designs or like arc designs where it kind of has like a circular circumference,
Right.
like a circular or circumference. Would that be kind of like a serious issue that's kind of going with 3D printing where it has a bit of an issue kind of going with that, or is it kind of almost solved now?
More so for like high stress applications or where you have like large amounts of force. So along the what's known as the printing path, where it lays it out, you have layers sort of like say a phone book, to where it can be pulled apart and like separated layer by layer, but overall the structure on a whole tends to have at least similar strength to objects.
And would you say with that, like, and this is kind of the final note, and then like, I think this or after this one, it would be just would steel have kind of the same? Would you think that if once we kind of got like, especially like a good melting point on steel with a 3D printer, would it still kind of have those same problems as with plastic, or do you think it might be kind of a different situation that may happen with metals.
Well, the so with metal printing, it's closer to, say, welding, where instead of a stream of liquid material, or like a semi-solid,
Yeah.
being deposited, it's more fused to itself.
It's almost like a soldering.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. And so what's really interesting about 3D printing with metals is the complexity of it, because you can build specific structures. It brings your metal closer to something like say, a carbon nanotube sort of
okay.
structure. So you can get, like, with specific force and stress applications, you can build complex structures that are going to handle that specific thing a lot better. Where, like, say you have a metal rod that's strong but rather brittle, and if you were to bend it enough, it could snap. You can build a structure that's going to take that stress application much better than something that's just a solid piece of metal.
And do you think as well that there's like, because I'm starting to see as well, we're talking through this, especially with the layering, and that factor with there, it could also be like, do you think there could be also like kind of a future where what the 3D printing does incredibly well is actually interweaving plastics and metals together, or some type of like dual composite kind of materials? Would you think like 3D printing might be able to do that way better than what we even have like manufacturing today? Like what is it, like nanofiber intertwined together with like other like a metal or something to make it a very high durable kind of item? Do you think 3D printing actually has a really stark advantage?
Yeah. So with like it thinking to think of, say, instead of one specific part, thinking of a whole object where you have where you need, say, like a very strong base, and then in between your strong points you need flexibility. It becomes a lot easier to produce that object on a whole, where, say, you have metal rods that have a plastic or flexible material in between, to where you don't have to manufacture those and then find a way to assemble them into something. You can
Yeah.
print them side by side,
Yeah, and it's
as
almost
long as you can work with the melting points, per se, of
yeah.
the different objects.
Oh yeah, that's true. The melting points is a main point, and that's as well like it's almost kind of like the weakness of 3D printing might be a huge advantage because of like the whole idea of it can only do by layers. But now if you do the layers by mixing them together, that's almost kind of like that advantage where finding a way just kind of going through there and making, like as you said, that really like flexible but high durable kind of object. And speaking as well, like working with different kind of like plastics or metals with this potential 3D printing, what do you think as well, just to kind of move into the home, where do you think like 3D printing, are there any aspects with that, or even just in general 3D printing potential within the home and how that can kind of expand?
Well, I think the largest advantage is going to come down to certain aspects of waste. So one of the largest things, especially in the 3D printing community that I've seen, is functional prints, where something like um, a knob, essentially, for a small appliance, or a hinge or a hook, small parts that may break during regular use, become easy to recreate and then create on the fly, so you don't
Yeah.
essentially, like a larger thing that you have in your home doesn't become obsolete because one small crucial part breaks, because you can simply redesign it, improve it, and print it within the same day, depending on what skills you have.
Yeah, and that's what I noticed. Like that was the beginning. Those small beginning parts was always with like, even at my work or like other places. Exactly how you said it was like those fine like little points where if it broke, you would have to go to some craft shop that specializes in where you would have to get an arm and a leg just to purchase that small little part that could kind of be 3D printed now, or it even has kind of like that the concept plan already. You just have to find that online and then getting that concept plan, and then you can basically print it out, and it's very very cost effective to kind of get that through, and that kind of just kind of changes that base kind of through there, especially in terms of finding those the blueprints kind of online there. would you say that there's also kind of like a strong like kind of potential for that part in terms of blueprinting with 3D printing, like kind of online and sharing that through? Is there a lot of potential within the home to kind of not so much develop a culture, but like kind of do it yourself, kind of at home 3D printing? You almost kind of have where it could be almost a new kind of renaissance of like the stay at home or like not stay at home but like freelance kind of the engineers or people that kind of develop that in their free time where it's like a very interesting scenario might be able to come up through or
No,
kind of that
absolutely.
idea.
And I think that it really is sort of a revolution in one of humanity's sorts of humanity's basic virtues is creating and improving. And
Yeah.
so now that like we have that in the home, it's exactly like you say. You have people who, as a hobby, they can improve designs of things that they need, or communicate and get designs from other things, and it becomes a lot easier to improve upon things because of the rapid prototyping aspect of 3D printing. You can create a model, and if it isn't exactly what you wanted after you printed it, you've maybe lost out on 3 to 4 hours and 30 cents worth of filament.
Yeah, and you have a lot of basically you can kind of go into the workshop and retest kind of models over and over again and really try to kind of get it set through and everything through that, which and that's even just at home. That's not even talking about like in terms of anything from like STEM field from like engineering to parts manufacturing or anything like within academia where that's like the perfect I would even say that's the perfect scientific method right there because it's cheap, efficient, and you can test out those parts at a very efficient rate to kind of go through. Do you think there's as well like because there is obviously like really great potential, but do you think there's certain potentials as well within like anything from STEM field where it could influence at home or even at home kind of influencing kind of STEM field or just in general kind of
Well,
any of that
I
part?
think something too that's a really big kind of a boon to that to STEM is just the accessibility, and
Mm-hmm.
so from like a scientific models for educational purposes become a lot
Oh yeah,
more
that's true.
accessible and more. It brings it sort of to the hobby realm
Mm-hmm.
of the hobby maker. Especially for schools where you don't need to say order all of these
Yeah.
parts and then have them brought to you like models of cells or
Yeah, I was thinking like at the most basic level, like 1980s, every science class always had the skeleton to
yeah.
show that anatomy. Now you can just 3D print all the skeleton parts for like $50 worth of like plastic, or I wouldn't even know, but like
Oh yeah,
definitely
well,
very cheap.
yeah. I making say a rough estimate, a general kilogram spool tends to run like $15 on the cheaper end, and so
Mm-hmm.
to print a full scale, say skeleton or anatomical model is definitely at or below the $50 price range, and you have a much higher. There's a lot more that you can do than just having one in the classroom where there's an
Yeah,
actual process of creating that, getting that, and then watching it being made.
that's true. That's also kind of like where you can start to do not so much like a cross education, but I could see where like obviously going into like in terms of college, it's not as kind of well, it is as important, but with the exact example that you gave through there, seeing in high school, that is definitely a way to get in terms of more people interested in terms of engineering and basically like kind of architectural design or engineering design and kind of building it
Oh,
and just
absolutely.
basically having a 3D printing shop where before we used to have the old woodwork shops which would kind of help out, but that's more kind of the old carpentry. Now almost we can have that potential in the classrooms for 3D printing where I could see a lot of people again like starting to develop in terms of stay at or the not stay at home but like the freelance kind of engineers that they don't really work for any company but rather they're all supplanted and supplied by just making those algorithms, and like I could see that as well having an origin from like learning in high school and just basically testing out the 3D printer and like finding out all of its possibilities. And do you think as well there's a lot of potential within kind of like to kind of boost that new kind of like the freelance engineer or kind of that factor there, especially with a lot of the different creations that's really possible that you can put through 3D printer?
Oh, absolutely. So I think in it's really the cost that's the largest, like the entry cost of 3D printing nowadays. Like the printer that I got was $160.
That is for a new piece of technology. That is incredibly cheap.
Absolutely.
I can imagine isn't it like Nintendo Switch and like the newest PS5 or whatever the fuck? That's like fucking $700, like $700,
both of those
$400.
cost more than having a 3D printer. You
Like,
know,
the matter of potential for it to be able to create is absolutely insane. Like, you could basically almost print up like, or at least sometime in the future, you could almost potentially like, just print up basically like a Nintendo Switch and almost have it towards like the point where it's operating at like
oh yeah,
like that amount and stuff.
I think the kind of the spirit of 3D printing really taps into that larger expanse of manufacturing where you have hobbyist 3D printers, people 3D printers.
Yeah. Or how it's called, like the Yeoman manufacturer.
Absolutely.
Everyone will be their own manufacturer sometime in the future.
No, in like that kind of coupled with the resource that is the internet, you have people who are getting into robotics and electronics and pretty much all kinds of aspects just of what used to be a really high profile intellectual field,
Yeah.
and bringing it down to the hobby level where it isn't expensive to do it. You know, the entry cost isn't disqualifying for the average person, and I think that's the biggest boon that's going to be to just humanity.
Yeah, and do you think it's going to have still kind of the same effect how kind of with like film where old film cameras, it was the big giant film camera that you had to be like an expert in order to kind of know, or you would have to know a guy basically, and they were expensive as all hell. Or like, and now kind of how it evolved to a point where any person can get a GoPro, a basic mic, and just essentially start filming and doing basically a YouTube channel and going through that.
Yeah, I
Do
was
you
going to
think-
say it's kind of like the YouTube content creator of the manufacturing industry for sure.
And do you think there's gonna be kind of like, is it gonna reach around the same point as how with filming things or stuff kind of went, or do you think it's gonna be even more extreme in terms of like a societal impact where it's gonna go nuts, like really crazy?
Well, I think it's easy to be a little over optimistic about what it could do, where it's getting, it's getting like cheap enough and efficient enough to where anybody can pick it up, but just sort of like a musical instrument, it's still sort of a
Gotcha.
niche hobby. And so I don't know if I would see the 3D printer as pervasive as like a coffee machine
Gotcha.
in home, but I do think that it's definitely going to gain traction more so and really break out and improve all of these industries.
It's like how gaming evolved and it was old brick things, and then now it's becoming more of a household kind of thing, and it's basically kind of more kind of like on that general level rather than like how we thought like, oh, flying cars in the future. Everyone's gonna have a flying car, and that didn't actually turn out exactly like that. And so it's probably gonna be somewhere in the middle where it's like something that it will expand definitely the group in terms of like engineering, crafting, anything like that, especially with manufacturing. But it'll kind of be still not so much a niche, but it's going to start to open up a lot more than how it is now, where engineering, you have to be with a company. That like there's literally no other way. You cannot
Right, you can't do it on your own.
independent. But then this can kind of start to open that up a lot more, where people can kind of have that opportunity. Kind of the same with film, where you have to be connected with a production company. Period.
Right.
You cannot make your own stuff, and all of a sudden now it becomes far more available to kind of go through.
No, I think something that may be sort of easy to akin it to, that goes kind of hand in hand, is pretty much YouTube and SoundCloud. The idea of what it means to produce and sort of start to sustain yourself on creating music or creating content videos, where you needed the large entry cost to be covered by a large corporation. It's going to create a community essentially where that's more of like a in-home and casual thing.
And speaking about the community part, I don't actually personally know, but would you say, is there already basically kind of almost like the YouTube for 3D printing engineering community already out there? Or is there a very like strong group that's kind of going? Or is it still kind of the wild west of different forms that do kind of little things, but there's not that like central mecca of like YouTube or Facebook or like that main point that everybody goes to. Is there already some small community that already is starting to build up like that kind of center point?
So I think it's definitely getting there where you're seeing kind of people of all walks of life using it for different applications, from engineers to like hobbyists with sculptures and everything. And it's really pulling all of those together. Right now, as far as I've seen and gotten into, it's a large like Reddit community, and there's a few
Gotcha.
different websites that have where you can share 3D files for free or for money if you want to try and make money off of that. And more other industries have been kind of picking up on the open source nature of it, where one of the most interesting things that I've seen is the Smithsonian. It's a program they started called Scan the World, where they've begun 3D scanning artifacts in certain things within their collection. Like many of them they don't have on display, they're just stored for posterity.
Yeah.
And then it makes it accessible to anybody on the internet at home to create and then see that and have that in a sense.
That's where they can get like, that's what I remember you were, because this is like just in the past you were looking up and we were finding like all of the different models, like old Smithsonian or like even like statues and stuff. Was that probably where they gained that from, like the kind of the open source Smithsonian that made it available to all people?
No, absolutely.
That's
It's
awesome.
definitely gaining more and more traction, sort of as an entertainment media and something to say like a novelty pursuit, as well as serious people who are, making like sculptures, miniatures for tabletop gaming,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
trying
that's
to
a
make
big
money
one.
off of that. Absolutely,
That's a big one.
it's really breaking out into all different kinds of hobbies and improving them and making them a lot more accessible and easy to start.
Yeah, and that's also a very good kind of way to start delving into, because especially like going into like the whole, it will expand in terms of tabletop gaming and everything there. And the same thing as well, where the Smithsonian, they put it up to open source where you could find it through. And then it's like kind of where it's going to start to, for certain, like any kind of new technologies that starts to expand, where do you think the first kind of battlegrounds in terms of, because the whole thing, not in a bad way, but it reeks in terms of patent issues that are going to start to happen heavily, like copyright or anything where it's like you can take the 3D model and you can print it out, and that's what we talked about before, where it was it the Baby Yodas before?
Yeah, Baby
Yeah.
Yoda was a big kind of explosion where as soon as the first episode of The Mandalorian came out, anybody who was a hobby 3D modeler was putting out theirs and printing a Baby Yoda, and Disney hadn't released any sorts of merchandise waiting for the holiday season, and so you've got a large chunk of people who already have a satisfactory Baby Yoda thing before Disney had a chance to sell it to them. But
and-
I think in the end it's going to be an improvement on these sorts of things, where it sort of it eliminates the entry cost of liking something, where
Yeah.
you can get a free model of anything essentially, even copyright objects. The same copyright laws apply, and so it's all, as far as that goes, it's all based upon pretty much like profit intent. So somebody who modeled their own Baby Yoda wouldn't necessarily be able to sell their printed models for a profit, because that is Disney's IP. But if they were to model it and distribute it for free, there's no legal issue with that, and then it makes it more accessible
That's
to people who
true.
can't spend $40 at a Disney store.
I will say that as well, because the interesting part, because I looked through, I think it was one part of, I think it was with copyright, was because it's a lot, unless it's transformative in some way,
Right.
it actually isn't even making another copy, or I would even say just basically with the blueprints, because that's a very interesting, that's where I see like the hugest issue, where there's going to be a few battlegrounds that start to happen with, in terms of the people, the government influence, and then as well with businesses, is kind of the idea of making that intellectual property and the intellectual property right, because technically that's what I found. Technically, any kind of fan art or anything like that technically is actually fully illegal. You can't actually do that. That's what I found out. The certain part of the law is they can shut it down unless, of course, it's educational, transformative, of parody or any kind of factor like that. But if it's just a blatant, just literally if like somebody just drew Mickey Mouse and put it onto like DeviantArt or somewhere there, they could technically get a cease and desist from Disney to say to shut it down.
Right.
But it happens so much that people kind of ignore it. But what happens to some of those patents where they're going to get such notoriety because it's some good modeler that made a way better, basically, 3D printable toy than the toys that are being sold or figurines that are being sold by Disney or other companies? Could you see like a lot of kind of battlegrounds happening from that? And just in general, where do you think like some of those legal battlegrounds are going to start to develop in this Wild West that most likely is going to start to develop through?
Well, I think a large aspect of that is, like you were saying, kind of going to be a saturation based sort of fight where large companies they aren't going to go after every single person who's modeling or drawing a baby Yoda, but something that's taking away from their profit and somebody selling it is going to be an avenue that they want to pursue. But I think with that, the one of the larger and kind of more nebulous ideas of copyright infringement is going to be whether or not people saving money by creating their own is going to be considered making money off of their idea, where you don't have to buy this baby Yoda toy because you printed your own.
Yeah,
and so is that taking money away from Disney because it was accessible to you through free market?
I could see, and like if you agree or just as well, like to add on with that, because I could see with that in terms of, for sure, there's going to be big companies that are immediately going to go, and I know like Nintendo and Disney, they're going to go right to the jugular.
Yeah.
They're going to start going Supreme Court to start to go towards potential loss of profit that happen because these free 3D printed, they can do it for free, but it's intellectual property, but it's loss of potential kind of profit.
You got to pay for...
Oh yeah, so this is Chris, if you'd like to introduce.
Stepped in, but
but
it's not free. It still costs. You got to buy the material and make it. And
well, but
a lot of the blueprints and 3D models, you have to pay for those too.
But the primary part is just it's gonna be Disney and like for sure Nintendo. They're going to try to get to the Supreme Court specifically in terms of, and this is where it would be an interesting, where they're going to say basically it's potential loss of profit because they're using like these intellectual properties, which is the blueprints shared through, and they're printing out rather than buying the true intellectual property that's produced by the official source, Nintendo or Disney. And the big thing I see from there is it's kind of like that piracy issue that happened in video games, where a lot of video game companies were like, nope, no piracy, no piracy. But then Steam and I forget the guy, but he said is like, you know what? No, we're gonna go relax and we're gonna go with the people on this more. Do you think something might happen where like you have like Universal Studios is then like, you know what? We're going to invest in 3D printer like model people. We're gonna hire them and we're gonna support you guys and kind of in the future. Well, even not like the 3D models, but even support the community and be okay with it. Is there some ground that might evolve through, or do you think you have like another idea that might be able to like kind of grow from there?
I think that would definitely be the smart move, because as far as those, while they're still sort of like hammering out the details of sort of what it's like a new definition of intellectual property coming to a 3D model, where a person has to create that either from their own visual reference or other aspects, and then going even further, once you take a 3D model, you put it through a program that essentially slices it into 1 millimeter high slices of cake, and so even that process could be considered its own sort of contained, exactly, and so you can sort of retain the rights to even just the code from that.
And just to interject as well, just real quickly, about like just to interject quickly about like the concept with that as well is it's kind of like where before, without 3D printing, a person could do a model and they could do from paper, online, make a full sculpted model, but they never had the opportunity to basically just produce at their own home, which kind of makes that loss of potential profit because they can't really do that. They still have to go to the store and buy whatever is the official product. But now it's going to be every coming day, it's going to be easier and easier to basically loophole it essentially, or basically people can print from home the home bought or intellectual property kind of made in terms of like the different way where it's going to become easier where that could open up like basically the can of worms of just where companies for sure are going to jump onto that and try to restrict like crazy on like that part there. And so like that was just a brief kind of like just the interjection because that was kind of as well the aspect there is that you never had that before. It was the same thing with like television or radio when it was coming through. People were able to kind of do their own stuff now rather than going towards newspapers. So there was this new avenue for a new type of thought kind of going through.
Right, and one that's like, cheaper essentially to put out. Yeah, no, I think touching on that, I do think it's going to get pretty messy on the large scale. You know, individual people will probably be safe as long as they aren't trying to sell these things. I think the smartest way to approach that, if you consider like Funko Pops, would be if a company like Funko Pop set up a Funko Pop vending machine kind of that was a 3D printer where you can peruse their own 3D models and then make the one that you want for a cost. Essentially, and so you can still, you know, you go through them for materials, IP, and process, and then you get the product out of it.
And that's what I was just thinking. Do you think what's going to happen now is it's going to start to become where basically you're just... Actually, yeah, I was about to say, like, not really renting, but it's actually, like, you have, like, points where you go to, like, an area or, like, a store or probably an online, and you purchase, not the rights, but the rights to model a certain IP for like a certain amount of months just to make a model or something like that. Do you think that there's points where it can almost become kind of like you kind of rent out that IP or you buy that IP like for $3 and then now you have that certain model that you can kind of print and then kind of print for your own and then kind of like can share or stuff like that? Do you think there's somewhere that can kind of grow as well? Or do you think that will kind of be stopped with...
I feel like companies and sort of intellectual property forces, something like Disney, would probably want to have a lot more personal control over that, but that would definitely be a worthy sort of distributor's license to explore, where you can set up areas and hobbyists to sort of spread your own IP just for, you know, community saturation and almost like advertising purposes, you know?
It's kind of like the Steam thing, how it's going in terms of with like Steam, where they kind of just accepted piracy, or not even accepted, but try to take advantage of that and trying to put towards like kind of just availability.
Yeah,
Same
making
thing
it
with
a
music.
positive force. Absolutely. No, I think that, and I think, you know, it will be a positive force in those kinds of things, simply because of the sort of, so one of the bars to say like an at the moment, like the vending machine idea, you know, it takes hours to 3D print something, and generally when you're searching for, if you're out looking for a product, you know, you're not going to sit at Target for 4 or 5 hours waiting for your Funko Pop to print, but on the other end of that, what you save in that is that you have that specific item at the point where it's needed. And so instead of shipping in mass and, you know, the waste product of what doesn't get sold, you're only getting what you want at the place that you want it. And so you can end up sort of restructuring your supply chain of products.
And that was actually where we were talking before previously, where he actually made a point exactly towards there in terms of kind of a cutting out the middleman and kind of restructuring that supply structure and just kind of like how it would be for the better in those aspects there. If you'd like just to kind of delve further into that, because that was actually a very interesting point where you started we were talking beforehand with that. Just like how that will kind of restructure and like pulling out the middleman, how can that kind of really benefit in terms of kind of sales for entertainment product, etc.?
Well, I think the biggest it's going to come sort of to the idea of automation restructuring our manufacturing, like the face of manufacturing, you know, where you'll be able to create lots of different parts in a single space. And so where you needed different industrial molds and different materials coming from all over these places.
Coming from the nail factory, coming from the other factory, this factory producing individual ones.
Right, and shipping it, you know, we're going to be able to restructure the entire logistics of manufacturing to localize it to where it's needed, and I think that that's going to have a really large environmental impact from shipping and packaging costs. You know, just the expenditure of fuel to bring these areas over, and it's going to really let us sort of trim the fat on what it means to be a consumer-driven economy.
Yeah, and the overproduction of stuff as well. I like the point as well where you're saying with kind of that overproduction. And as well, to go on to another part where you're actually going in terms of automation, that also kind of brought to me like a lot of different points as well with that, because would you say as well there's a lot of potential outside with 3D printing in terms of either like sales jobs, but even more 3D printing, not exactly with metals or plastics, but like that's where I was also saying before, it was like the idea of the 3D printed pizza that can get delivered to your door. Is there a lot of potential as well in terms of kind of evolving the food market where it can start to create a lot of situations where that automation starts to kind of fully go through? Because you could even make like 3D printed patties going right onto like the grill or anything like that. It's like there's a lot of potential for that, for like a 3D printed food system, or even just any other systems like outside of just metal and plastic. Are there a lot of like places where that could really grow?
Yeah, I think it's a pros and cons sort of situation that depends on the way you look at it. But to say to kind of focus on the 3D printed patty and automating that away with 3D printers, or automating, you know, McDonald's jobs away, there's definitely a loss in a large corporation who can use a 3D printer or a machine to simply create the patties at the point, you know, and replace these people.
It's like a loss of manpower where that becomes a societal factor, like for sure,
Right.
huge kind of tidal wave coming around the bend might be possible.
No, and I think it'll be sort of a transition, and the larger issue to tackle with that would be the sort of the profit funnel, where that comes into the issue of the economy, like where if you aren't paying employees or locals to do this menial job, you know, all of that money is just heading up the chain to the CEO of the food industry. But I think the bigger gains from that are going to be sort of eliminating these menial jobs, where even with the idea of like, you know, food, you can eliminate all of the entry level menial food labor and free up a lot of people to explore other avenues, you know. So as long as we can figure out a way to encourage those people to achieve employment in what they want, it's a net win to get rid of the burger flipper, because nobody wants to flip burgers all day.
That's true. It does kind of, there is a small truth to that in terms of like a lot of the, not automated jobs, but like the manual labor or menial labor. I guess it's more of like the term that's better is the menial labor of just doing a one function that where a computer could do that. There's somewhat like of a hidden nugget of truth that kind of goes through, but it's just about kind of now adapting to it, and it's going to be a huge kind of societal just kind of push over into that kind of next stage where it's going to be very chaotic,
right?
And like kind of on that part. And as well, just ending on there, we are just going to take a brief intermission, although it's actually not going to be brief for you guys. It's going to be most likely instantaneous transmission or some part. but we'll see you guys soon. Hello, and we're back. Back from our little break. It was very instantaneous for you guys, but we kind of talked over, and as a good kind of conclusion point to kind of put that ribbon or that bow right on top of this whole discussion, it's actually a good question to kind of ask in terms of where is it going to be in terms of the future of 3D printing, particularly kind of the societal, engineering, science, and like kind of a positive outlook? How much can it really change our world for the positive with the new advancements of 3D printing?
Well, I think it's going to be sort of a culmination of a lot of different fields. So just a second ago, we were talking about the 3D printed burger patty, and what that means for the person that creates that. And I think that one of the biggest sorts of benefits of that is going to sort of be personalization and quality of life. So thinking specifically to a burger, you have to raise a cow, butcher a cow, ship and prep its meat, and then prepare its meat. And those are all separate individual processes occurring at separate locations per se. Whereas with the potential future, combined with our recent breakthroughs in artificial meat, Beyond Meat, and other products, you're going to be able to essentially, you eliminate the industrial farming and the troubles of that. You can cut back on the shipping costs of bringing those around and around the world.
Doesn't take a lot of methane or anything at all, like any greenhouse gases whatsoever.
Absolutely, less greenhouse gases and less suffering overall. From the cow up to the burger flipper, to where like fast food was a revolution in modern society to just have that accessibility and that automation of the food creation process. And I think 3D printers are just going to localize and specialize that.
And it almost
more.
kind of uplifts it even further, where it's going to be kind of like this new mechanism that basically it makes things more available, but it's even more efficient and even more beneficial.
No, absolutely. And a big thing with that is the personalization of materials, where if it's something that's in a household application, you can personalize it to your dietary needs. You can sort of control what sorts of nutrients and materials are going in there, so that you can have build a gluten-free patty or cruelty-free meat, and increase the nutrient value of that manufactured edible product.
Yeah, and just to interject as well, because it's a very interesting, it kind of like a light bulb lit up really quick when you said it was availability, was another part is that could easily start to really affect and start to reduce world hunger as well in a lot of different nations where they're really struggling. The main thing that I think about is like in terms of salvageable water and drinkable water, scientists and everybody is starting to create in terms of ways. It's like this pill that you put into the dirty water and it collects all that dirt and makes clean water. What do you think about like 3D printing? Because it will be so easy, just rather than shipping whole tons of cattle, rather you just get a little 3D printer, like a efficient food printing system, and then as well the nutrient kind of strips that will be put towards that. And you can really help out in terms of world hunger and kind of really solve those issues.
Oh, absolutely. It can be, you can ship it sterile, so you don't have to worry about
sterilization
the time
as well.
The temperature that you're shipping foods at. And just like you said, whereas you may have to ship a whole sort of a whole car full of unprocessed meat, process it, and then distribute it, you can fit it all into a nice little cube and ship that cube efficiently to where it's needed. Yeah, sterile, and absolutely. And speaking especially to water and clean water, as 3D printing gets more precise and a lot more efficient and cheap in that same vein, you can start to literally print filter apparatuses on demand, to filter water,
Yeah, I
and
wonder if
even
it could-
to
It's like a reverse engineer. It's a reverse engineer filter where it basically not really printing water, but it's ejecting all of the particulates that are poisonous or toxic.
right, and
just
building
ejecting
more
out.
complex structures, to collect those.
Yeah, no, that's true as well. And like speaking about where you were saying it can be easily compartmentalized in like really small space. For sure, this is going to be a huge amount of influence and benefits in terms of with a lot of space. No pun intended. Space.
Oh,
At
absolutely.
like space travel. What do you think about there, where there's like a lot of possibility where it can really help out? Not just even with food, but like other aspects of like what is it like
Right.
building small
Replacement
drones
parts
or
and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's definitely one of the largest sorts of the two main issues with that we have with living in space is shipping volume and shipping weight. And so you can cut back on volume by shipping bulk material that can then be processed into strange specific shapes so that you don't have to sort of Tetris them in per se to a certain space, and then with weight too, once you have those materials, it becomes a lot easier to prototype or test apart the moment that you need it without having to ship up multiples for a failed part or sorts of you ship up less waste essentially,
yeah.
and you get exactly what you need at that time. And
And
so
I could even see like the ability to basically found a colony on Mars, and then you can 3D print not 3D print a rocket most likely, but you can ship it up and then 3D print a drone to attach to it, and now you can eject the drone farther out into space than we were able to do with Earth, and you even have that kind of leg up where it can kind of expound out even further and like discover
I did
parts
hear
there.
too that when we want to eventually start habiting Mars and stuff like that, like trying to build shelters there and stuff, they're working on making technology that can use the Martian sand and turn it into like a concrete and 3D print housing out
That's
of
true.
that, like and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
using it for like robots and stuff like that too.
It's a complete efficiency where you basically have like the creative
And
mode.
ship its stuff there too.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like a creative game mode of a producer that can produce almost anything if you get the resources. In that part, you can make a more advanced kind of 3D printing machine that could take in different resources and kind of modules on that part to basically do, as you said, like with the Martian sand, or even be able to kind of put on that part. It makes it
Won't
like
be able to bring materials there with them to build a habitat, basically.
Right.
So they'll have to use what they have there, and all there is a lot of dirt. like
No, and
That's
that'll
true.
that'll be kind of the culmination of all of those things where you can. It's a localized factory, and it's so easy to sort of retrofit for different applications. To like in the future, we could have a single 3D printer and then have a specific like nozzle and specialized part to
Yeah.
print housing materials, medical devices, and food, all
Yeah.
from the same machine.
as you
Essentially.
were and as you were saying was like before, the utilitarian aspect when describing through 3D printing, the utilitarian aspect is incredibly powerful with the 3D printing device. Where would you say, just as like a kind of quasi final, just to put the bow on, and this is for both of you guys as well, would you say in terms of like with that part, is it something that like the utility of it, it's going to be something so great that it's going to be that new device like a computer? Is it going to revolutionary? Maybe not even for home consumers. It's not going to be everywhere, but definitely for sure in terms of governmental, military, sciences. In terms of that utilitarian aspect, you got your main box that can basically produce almost anything if you can get the science and the work on it, which eventually
I think
that
it
will
definitely
happen.
has
It's
the
possible.
potential. But at the moment, right now, it's not at that point. But
Yeah.
it could be eventually if we look more into it.
Yeah, eventually we'll make it. And
No, and I think that the computer is probably one of the best models where we can see that revolution happening within our lifetime and at
Oh,
a speed
yeah.
that you couldn't
It is
predict.
insane.
Like when we were kids, when I was probably like 12 years old.
The dial-up.
Oh yeah.
We had that.
That's
And
always great.
and in that same vein, like I went to my parents' work while they were at Honeywell, and they had a 3D printer. Honeywell had a 3D printer that they would use to manufacture prototypes and parts and everything. And it's this crazy future technology and everything, and you could never really imagine having something like that in your home. And now it costs less than $200 to start out with that. I think it's definitely going to revolutionize what it means to be an advanced society, having that sort of accessibility.
Yeah, and with that, I would say that is a perfect kind of wrap-up for the show. And to just kind of finalize everything, if you, Fishman, or with you, Chris, would you like to add in anything just in terms of any thoughts, anything you want to say with our very small audience, just Greg and Tony? What would you like to say
I just
to
want
them?
to bring up what I said before. Like, once we find out how to print biological matter, that's going to take 3D printing to a whole nother level. And that's going to be when it revolutionizes everything. Is because we can do food and trinkets right now, but like, once you're able to like print a human heart and place it into somebody and it functions, like that's when it's going to go off the rails and totally change the way everything happens.
Yeah, that'll be the beginning of post-scarcity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. We won't have problems with food or disease.
And do you have
or
any?
Consumerism.
Do you have any final thoughts, or just anything to say as well, or just in general?
To our
the
listeners,
audience?
get a 3D printer.
We are sponsored by 3D printing. Buy a 3D printer.
All of it.
But in general, thank you so much for listening to the Morbidly Elenctic podcast, and hope you guys have a great day.